After my divorce, I thought delivering packages would be just another forgettable job, something to keep me busy while I tried to glue my life back together. But one rainy afternoon, I dropped a box at a mansion that looked frozen in time. The door creaked open, and an old man stared at me with trembling hands. "You're a Thompson, aren't you?" he whispered. When I said yes, he started to cry. "Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with me, because what happened next completely changed my life." It was one of those late autumn days when the sky can't decide whether it wants to cry or not. Gray clouds hung low, and the air smelled like rain and dead leaves. My van heater had been broken for weeks, so I was driving through the cold with a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee and a list of 35 deliveries still to go. That's when I saw it. An address I didn't recognize. Whitmore Estate, 441 Elmwood Hill Road. The name alone sounded like money. Usually, my route took me through small suburban homes, rundown apartment complexes, and the occasional gated community. But this was different. The GPS showed a long, twisting road climbing into the woods. At first, I thought it was a mistake. The lane was covered in fallen branches, and the mailbox leaned sideways like it had given up years ago. Still, the package label was clear. I sighed, grabbed my scanner, and started up the narrow driveway. The place looked abandoned at first glance. Towering oak trees surrounded an enormous brick mansion, its windows dim behind heavy curtains. The walls were lined with ivy, the fountain in front dry and cracked. It was beautiful in a sad, haunting kind of way, like time had stopped here and forgotten to start again. I rang the bell once. Nothing. Twice. Then, faintly, I heard movement inside. A few seconds later, the massive wooden door opened just enough for an elderly man to peek through. He looked ancient, white hair thin as snow, hands trembling slightly as he leaned on the doorframe. But his eyes were sharp and searching. "Can I help you, sir?" I asked, holding up the package. "Delivery for a Mr. Henry Whitmore." His mouth twitched, and for a long second, he just stared at me. Then his voice came out like a cracked whisper. "You're a Thompson, aren't you?" I blinked. Yeah, William Thompson. How did you?" Before I could finish, his face crumpled. Tears welled in his eyes, and he covered his mouth as if he'd seen a ghost. "Oh my God," he murmured. "I've been looking for your family for 70 years. My brain couldn't catch up. I glanced at the box again, half expecting it to explain what was happening. "I think you've got the wrong guy, sir. I'm just the delivery driver." He shook his head, stepping aside and motioning for me to come in. His hand trembled violently as he pointed toward the entryway. "Please, come inside, William. You have no idea how long I've waited for this day." Everything inside me screamed that this was a bad idea. My boss would kill me if he found out I'd left the van running for a chat with a stranger. But something about the man's expression, pure shock mixed with desperate hope, kept me from walking away. The interior of the house was breathtaking, though dusty and frozen in another era. Oil paintings of men in military uniforms lined the walls. A chandelier hung low over the foyer, its crystals dim with age. The scent of old books and cedar filled the air. The man led me into a parlor where the fire was dying in the hearth. "Sit, please," he said, lowering himself into a chair with visible effort. "I'm Henry Whitmore, and if you're really a Thompson, then fate has finally kept its promise." I sat down, confused but curious. "Mr. Whitmore, I think you've mistaken me for someone else. My family's not exactly well known." He smiled faintly. "No, perhaps not now, but once, long ago, your grandfather was the bravest man I ever knew." That word, grandfather, hit me harder than I expected. I'd barely known anything about him. My father didn't talk much about his own dad. All I knew was that he'd served in the Korean War and died young, working in a factory. "What do you mean, my grandfather?" I asked slowly. Henry's watery eyes lifted to the fireplace as if watching ghosts move inside the flames. "He saved my life in Korea. Samuel Thompson. That was his name, wasn't it?" My mouth went dry. "Yeah, it was." Henry nodded, and a single tear slid down his cheek. "Then I found you. I've finally found you." He reached for a small wooden box on the side table, his hands trembling. From it, he pulled an old envelope, yellowed and sealed with a wax crest. "This," he said, holding it out like it was made of glass, "has waited 70 years to find its rightful owner." I stared at the envelope. It had my family's name written in elegant, fading ink, Thompson. I don't understand, I said quietly. Henry took a deep breath. Your grandfather never claimed the reward he was owed. I tried to find him after the war, but he was gone. The world was different then, letters lost, people moved. I thought I'd failed him. But now you're here. My pulse quickened. Reward? For what? Henry gave a sad smile. For saving my life, son. In 1953, I leaned back in my chair, trying to absorb what he was saying. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm very serious, Henry said, his voice growing stronger. Your grandfather was a hero. And what he did that day, well, it deserves to be remembered. I owe him a debt I've carried all my life. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft crackle of the fire. Henry looked at the envelope like it was sacred, like it held the last piece of his unfinished soul. Please, he said, his tone pleading, stay a while. Let me tell you what happened. After that, I'll show you what belongs to your family. Something in me, the same instinct that had told me to step inside, urged me to stay. I nodded slowly. All right, I'll listen. Henry's shoulders relaxed, and for the first time, a faint smile crossed his face. Good, he whispered. Because this story started long before you were born, William, and it's time someone finally heard it. He leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire as the flames flickered against his weathered skin. It was 1953, he began softly. The winter was brutal, and the war was supposed to be ending. And just like that, I found myself pulled into a story that would change everything I thought I knew about my family and about myself. Henry's voice was low and deliberate, every word carrying the weight of years he'd never escaped. The crackling of the fire seemed to echo his memories, filling the room with a quiet ache. I was 21 when I shipped out, he began. A spoiled kid from a rich family. My father owned factories, and my mother hosted charity dinners for men who never came home. I didn't belong there, not really. I thought war was about medals and glory. I learned fast it wasn't. He stared at his trembling hands, then back at the flames. Our unit was stationed near the Imjin River, in one of those godforsaken valleys that froze you from the inside out. We were supposed to hold a line that didn't exist anymore. Every night, we'd hear gunfire echoing through the mountains. Every day, we'd lose another friend. He paused and looked at me. That's where I met your grandfather, Samuel Thompson. He was a field medic. Quiet man. Carried himself like someone who'd already seen too much. But when he smiled, rarely, mind you, it could calm anyone. He had this way of making the worst situations feel survivable. I listened, almost afraid to breathe. I had never heard my grandfather described in such detail. In my family, his name was a shadow, something honored, but never fully understood. Henry continued. It was February 1953. Coldest winter I'd ever known. We were out on patrol, trying to locate missing soldiers from another unit. The terrain was brutal. Ice, snow, enemy fire from the ridges. Our truck hit a mine. He clenched his jaw, eyes glistening. The explosion threw me 20 feet. I woke up half buried in snow, bleeding, my leg mangled. The others were gone. All except one man, your grandfather. I swallowed hard. He came crawling through the smoke, Henry said, voice cracking. Didn't care that bullets were still flying. I remember shouting at him to get out, to save himself. But he ignored me. He pulled me out of the wreck, tore strips from his own uniform to stop the bleeding, and carried me, on his back, 2 miles through enemy territory until we reached our base. He saved my life, William, and he never said a word about it. Not one. The room fell silent. I could hear the faint ticking of an old clock somewhere behind us. When the war ended a few months later, Henry went on. I spent weeks in a hospital in Tokyo. I wrote your grandfather a letter, thanking him, promising I'd repay his courage. But by the time I returned home, my father had arranged for me to manage his company. I got caught in business, politics, family greed, and when I finally went looking for Samuel Thompson, he was gone. He sighed deeply, eyes clouded with regret. I learned he'd come home to the States, started a family, but things were hard. The VA didn't take care of them like they should have. A man like your grandfather, he should have been honored. Instead, he died in a factory accident less than 10 years later. I felt a lump rise in my throat. My father had once told me that story, the accident, the sudden death, but he'd never mentioned the war. Never once. Henry leaned forward. Your grandfather refused my first attempt to repay him. He said, "You don't owe me anything, Henry. I just did my duty." That's who he was. A man who didn't measure worth by money. He gestured toward the old envelope resting on the table between us. But my father didn't see it that way. He was a proud man, a man of contracts and obligations. When he learned that your grandfather had refused payment, he wrote that letter, sealed it, notarized it, and placed a share of our family's mining trust in Samuel's name. He said, "One day, someone from his bloodline will come to claim what's rightfully his." But your family moved, and records were lost after a fire in our archives. He shook his head slowly. "I tried to find you, William. Decades went by. I hired investigators. Every lead went cold. I thought maybe the Thompsons had vanished entirely." His eyes glistened as he smiled weakly. "And then, yesterday morning, my housekeeper brought me the delivery schedule. I saw your name, William Thompson, on that slip of paper. After 70 years, I finally had a sign." I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight, my heart pounding in my ears. Henry chuckled softly through his tears. "Life is funny, isn't it? A boy who saved my life brings me a package 70 years later. I used to think fate was just a word people used to justify coincidences. But not anymore." He looked down at the envelope again, fingers tracing the old wax seal. "I've carried this guilt my entire life, knowing a debt was unpaid, a promise unkept. Your grandfather deserved better, and so does his family. Mr. Whitmore," I finally managed to say, "I don't even know what to say. I didn't know any of this." He smiled. "You don't have to say anything yet. The past is heavy, William, but sometimes it finds us for a reason." He placed the envelope gently in my hands. "Tomorrow," he said, "come back. I'll show you what's inside and what your family is owed." I nodded, still dazed. I didn't understand the full weight of what I was holding, but I knew it was something important, something sacred. When I finally left the mansion, the sun had already set, painting the sky in deep purples and red streaks. As I drove down the long road back to town, my mind raced with questions. Who exactly was my grandfather to this man? What was in that envelope? And why did I feel like I was standing at the edge of something that would change not just my life, but everything I thought I knew about my family? The moment I sat down in that grand living room, I could feel the weight of history pressing against the walls. Everything around me felt like it was whispering secrets of a life long lived. The ticking of the grandfather clock, the smell of old wood and pipe tobacco, the faint hiss of the fireplace. Harold returned from another room carrying a small wooden box, wrapped in a faded American flag. He held it with trembling hands, as if it were a holy relic. "This," he said softly, "is something I've been keeping for 70 years, waiting for the right Thompson to show up." I stared at him, my mind spinning. "The right Thompson?" I repeated. "Yes," he said, his eyes watery but steady. "Your grandfather, Henry Thompson, saved my life during the Korean War. He never knew what it meant, or maybe he did, but he never came to claim what was rightfully his." He placed the box on the table and opened it slowly. Inside was a yellowed envelope, sealed with wax, and an old black and white photograph of two young men in army uniforms, standing shoulder to shoulder, mud-stained but smiling. One of them was unmistakably my grandfather. "That's him," I whispered, my throat tight. Harold nodded. "We were stationed together near the Imjin River in 1953. I was only 19, and your grandfather was 23. We were kids pretending to be soldiers. That day, our unit was ambushed. I was pinned down, bleeding. He dragged me out, under fire. He could have left me there, but he didn't." He paused, his voice trembling. "After the war ended, my father, a wealthy industrialist at the time, promised a reward to any man who brought me back alive. Your grandfather refused it. Said he didn't save me for money. Said the only reward he needed was knowing I got home." I sat back, stunned. I'd heard stories about my grandfather, mostly from my dad, about how disciplined and quiet he was. But no one ever mentioned Korea. No one mentioned this man. "So you kept this box all this time?" I asked quietly. Harold smiled faintly. "Every single day, I looked at that photograph. I tried to track him down after the war, but the records were lost. I searched until I grew too old to keep looking. Then one day, a genealogist helping me organize my estate found a record, the Thompson family in my area. And when I saw your name on that delivery label, William Thompson, I thought, maybe fate finally caught up." He slid the envelope toward me. "Open it." My fingers shook as I broke the wax seal. Inside was a letter written in elegant cursive on thin, war-era stationery. The ink had faded, but I could still read it. To Mr. Harold Whitmore. If you are reading this, it means I was able to get you home. I don't need a reward. I just want you to live your life, marry, have kids, and never forget that someone believed your life was worth saving. Henry Thompson. I swallowed hard, trying to blink away tears. It felt like I was holding a piece of my family's soul, something my father had never known, something history had almost erased. But then Harold pulled out another envelope, this one newer, sealed with a crisp gold emblem. This, he said, was written by my father after the war. It was meant for Henry, but he refused to take it. I've held on to it, waiting to deliver it personally. He handed it to me. I tore it open, my curiosity burning through the shock. Inside was a letter and a legal document stamped with an old corporate seal. The letter read, "To the family of Henry Thompson. In gratitude for saving my son, I leave the right to claim a 10% ownership share in Whitmore Industries, to be transferred to Mr. Thompson or his heirs, should they ever come forward." My heart stopped. Whitmore Industries wasn't just any company. It was one of the largest logistics and shipping corporations in the country, the same company I had dreamed of working for when I was younger, before life and divorce and disappointment turned me into a delivery driver. I stared at Harold, speechless. "You mean this is real?" He nodded. The shares were never claimed. Adjusted for inflation, reinvested, and protected by a family trust, that 10% stake is worth roughly $40 million today. My mind went blank. I couldn't even process the number. $40 million. "I don't expect you to believe me right away," Harold said gently. "But I've already had my attorneys verify everything. The reward was real, and it was legally recorded. The shares were set aside in case your family ever appeared. Henry's humility may have refused the money, but history hasn't forgotten." I just sat there, my breath shallow. It felt like time had collapsed. 70 years of forgotten history, of unspoken gratitude, of one man's selfless act coming full circle. Harold leaned forward, his frail hands gripping mine. "Your grandfather was the kind of man who made the world better just by existing. I want his family to know that kindness still has a way of coming home." I didn't know what to say. All I could think about was how I'd been struggling to rebuild my life after the divorce, how every day delivering packages felt like a reminder of what I'd lost, my marriage, my confidence, my direction. And now, out of nowhere, this man, this stranger, was telling me that my family's past held the key to something far greater than money. It was legacy. It was honor. And maybe, just maybe, it was redemption. For the next few minutes, silence filled the room. The kind of silence that carries more meaning than words ever could. The old clock ticked behind us, each second echoing like a heartbeat. Harold stared into the fire, his expression distant, as if he was looking not at the flames, but at memories still burning from 70 years ago. I couldn't stop staring at that photograph on the table. My grandfather, young, strong, with that same square jaw I saw every morning in my mirror, smiling beside Harold. I'd never seen him smile like that in any of the faded family photos we kept at home. In those, he always looked serious, almost cold. But here, he looked alive. "Harold," I said quietly, "what was he really like?" "My grandfather, I mean." He turned toward me, eyes glistening. Henry was the kind of man people followed, even when they were scared out of their minds. He never raised his voice, but when he spoke, you listened. The kind of leader who carried others through hell without ever letting them see his own fear. He paused, then added, "But he carried guilt, heavy guilt. After the ambush, we lost several men. He blamed himself, even though none of us could have done anything different. That guilt, it stuck to him like a shadow." I leaned forward. "Did he ever talk about it?" "After the war?" Harold shook his head. "Never. I tried writing him once, years later, but the letter came back unopened. I think he wanted to leave that part of his life behind. Some men come home, but they never really return, you know?" I nodded slowly. My father used to say something similar, that his dad was a man of few words. A quiet farmer who rarely spoke about the past, but sometimes woke up in the middle of the night screaming names no one recognized. Now it all made sense. Harold reached into the box again and pulled out a small metal object, a dog tag. The edges were rusted, but the letters were still legible. Henry J. Thompson, U.S. Army. O+, Serial number 41298. I kept it after the battle, Harold said softly. He lost it when he was carrying me through the snow. I meant to return it, but when he refused the reward, I just held on to it. As a reminder of what courage looked like. I turned the tag over in my hand. It felt heavy, even though it weighed almost nothing. That tiny piece of metal had once hung around my grandfather's neck in a war that nearly broke him. And somehow, it had survived decades, outlasting him, outlasting his silence. I want you to have it, Harold said. It belongs to your family. I wanted to say thank you, but my voice cracked. I nodded instead. After a long moment, Harold stood up. There's something else I think you should see. He walked over to a bookshelf and pulled out an old leather-bound album. Inside were dozens of letters, correspondence between soldiers, commanders, and even news clippings from the 1950s. He handed me one that caught my eye. It was a newspaper article dated March 1953, headline reading, "Local hero saves fellow soldier in Korean ambush." I scanned the article, heart pounding. It mentioned Henry Thompson by name, detailing how he rescued a wounded comrade under heavy fire, carrying him 2 miles to safety. The journalist described him as a man whose bravery defied death itself. But the last paragraph hit me hardest. When offered a substantial financial reward by the soldier's family, Henry Thompson reportedly declined, saying, "I didn't do it for money. I did it because I couldn't live knowing I left someone behind." That line, "I couldn't live knowing I left someone behind," stayed with me. It was more than just a sentence. It was a reflection of who my grandfather had been. A man who believed doing the right thing mattered more than recognition, more than riches, more than comfort. Harold looked at me with something like pride. "You know, William, I've met a lot of men in my life. Businessmen, politicians, soldiers. But your grandfather was different. He didn't just save my life. He saved the kind of faith in humanity that money can't buy." I exhaled slowly. My dad never told me any of this. None of us knew. "He probably didn't know himself," Harold said gently. "Men like your grandfather, they carried their heroism quietly. He didn't want to be remembered as a savior. He wanted to be remembered as a man who did what needed to be done." We sat together for a while, flipping through the pages. Some letters were from other soldiers, some from families thanking Henry for what he'd done. Others were from Harold's father, trying to reach him, pleading for him to accept his gratitude. Every one of them had gone unanswered. As I turned the last page, I found a faded photograph of a farmhouse, my grandfather's house, unmistakably the same one where I'd spent summers as a kid. On the back, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "For Henry, in case he ever decides to visit again." That's when it hit me. My grandfather must have kept in touch, somehow, at least once. Maybe secretly. Maybe he wanted to make sure Harold was okay, but didn't want to reopen old wounds. Harold smiled wistfully. He never took the reward, but he left something with me. A belief that not everything good needs to be paid for. Still, I think he'd want his family to know that what he did mattered. That his legacy isn't lost. I felt my throat tighten again. He'd probably say, "You've already repaid him, Harold." Harold chuckled weakly. "Maybe so, but I think it's time I make it official." He stood, straightened his back with effort, and said, "Tomorrow, I'll take you to meet my lawyer. We'll start the transfer process for the reward your grandfather earned. It's the least I can do for the man who gave me my life, and for the grandson who showed up at my door." I didn't know whether to cry, laugh, or fall to my knees in disbelief. As I left the mansion that night, snow beginning to fall in soft flakes, I clutched the dog tag in my pocket. For the first time since my divorce, since losing everything I thought defined me, I felt a strange calm. Because maybe this wasn't just about a reward. Maybe this was about a man long gone, sending a message through time, reminding me that no act of goodness, no matter how forgotten, ever truly disappears. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. I barely slept that night. My mind was spinning like a storm that wouldn't calm down. The words, 10% of Whitmore Industries, echoed in my head like a distant drumbeat. $40 million. That number didn't even seem real. I'd spent the last few years living paycheck to paycheck, delivering packages in a dented van, eating instant noodles more nights than I'd like to admit. And now, suddenly, I was sitting on what could change my entire life, my entire family's life. But more than the money, there was something heavier on my chest, responsibility. It didn't feel like winning the lottery. It felt like inheriting a burden that wasn't entirely mine. My grandfather had refused that money for a reason. What if I wasn't supposed to take it either? As I sat in my small apartment sipping burnt coffee, the morning sun creeping through my blinds, I kept fingering the dog tag Harold had given me. Cold metal, but warm with meaning. I decided that, whatever happened, I had to do this the right way. By 10 a.m., I was back at the mansion. Harold greeted me at the door, looking pale but more alive than he had yesterday. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said with a small smile. "Neither did you," I replied. He laughed. "You're right. I suppose 70 years of waiting makes one a bit impatient when it's finally time." His lawyer, a tall, sharp-looking man in his 60s named Mr. Lawson, was already seated in the study. He had a briefcase full of documents, each stamped and labeled. When we walked in, he stood and shook my hand firmly. "Mr. Thompson, it's an honor. I've heard quite a story." "Yeah," I muttered, still unsure if I believed it myself. "It's been surreal." Lawson gestured for us to sit. He opened a thick folder and began speaking in that smooth, measured tone only lawyers seem to have. "I've reviewed all the old documents Mr. Whitmore preserved, including the notarized statement from his father dated 1953. The 10% equity was indeed set aside as an unclaimed reward. The shares were placed into a holding trust that has been maintained, with compounding dividends and reinvestment, for 70 years. I blinked. "So it's really still valid?" "Perfectly valid," Lawson said, sliding a document across the table. "It's protected under both the original Trust Act and subsequent inheritance law. Since Mr. Whitmore Sr. clearly stated that the reward was transferable to Mr. Thompson's heirs, that means you are legally entitled to it as the surviving descendant." He turned another page. "In today's terms, accounting for value appreciation, dividends, and compound interest, the total worth is just under $42.3 million. My breath hitched. 42 million. The kind of number that could erase every debt, every regret, every worry I'd ever had. But Harold leaned forward, his eyes soft. "William, before you say anything, I know what you're thinking. I thought the same thing when I was your age. But I want you to understand something." I turned to him. "This isn't a handout," he said. "This is restitution. A long overdue acknowledgement of what your grandfather did for me, and what he gave up." I looked down at the letter from the day before, Henry's words echoing in my head. "I just want you to live your life, marry, have kids, and never forget that someone believed your life was worth saving." "He didn't do it for money," I murmured. "He refused the reward." "Yes," Harold said. "But maybe that's because he knew one day it would find its way to someone who truly needed it. Someone who could honor it without being consumed by it." The lawyer cleared his throat politely. "Mr. Whitmore has arranged for a direct transfer of the trust to your name. You'll be a partial shareholder in Whitmore Industries once the paperwork is complete. You'll also receive a seat on the advisory board, should you wish to participate." My head was spinning. "Wait, a seat? Like, in the company?" "Yes," Lawson said, as a symbolic gesture. "But given your background in logistics and delivery, I'd argue it's more than symbolic. You might find your grandfather's legacy intersecting with your own life in unexpected ways." I laughed softly, disbelief bleeding through. "I deliver packages in a beat-up van, and you're telling me I could sit on a board of a billion-dollar corporation?" Harold chuckled. "Fate has a funny sense of humor, doesn't it?" We spent the next 2 hours signing papers. The more I signed, the heavier everything felt, the ink drying like a promise on each page. Not a promise to become rich, but to be worthy. Afterward, Harold poured us both a glass of tea and said quietly, "You know, William, I don't have any children. My wife passed long ago, and I never remarried. For years, I thought I'd die alone, leaving this world owing a debt I could never repay. But now, I feel like I can finally rest easy." I didn't know what to say. I could only whisper, "You don't owe anything anymore. My grandfather would have been proud that you remembered him." Harold smiled faintly. "And he'd be proud of you, too. You didn't come here looking for money. You came because you cared." As the day went on, Mr. Lawson finalized the transfer details, and we took a short break in the garden. The sun had broken through the clouds, painting the mansion's grounds in gold. Harold walked beside me slowly, leaning on his cane. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "Of course. When you knocked on that door yesterday," he said, "I was about to sell this house. I didn't think I had anyone left to share it with. I prayed that, before I went, I'd have one more reason to believe life still held surprises. And then you showed up, with your grandfather's name. I felt a lump form in my throat. He continued, "That wasn't an accident, William. I don't believe in coincidences anymore. Some debts don't expire, and some stories, they find their way home, no matter how long it takes." That night, as I drove home with the paperwork safely tucked in my bag, I didn't feel like a millionaire. I felt like a messenger, carrying the final chapter of a promise made in the snow 70 years ago. I stopped at a red light, looked down at the dog tag on my dashboard, and whispered, "We finally brought it home, Grandpa." The light turned green, and for the first time in years, I felt like my life, the broken, messy, unpredictable life I'd been living, finally had a purpose again. The next few weeks felt like stepping into another life, one I never imagined I'd live. My days as a delivery driver were over, replaced by meetings with attorneys, financial advisors, and company representatives from Whitmore Industries. But no matter how polished the conference rooms or how expensive the suits, I carried my grandfather's dog tag in my pocket everywhere I went. It reminded me who I really was, and who I never wanted to become. On my first official visit to Whitmore's corporate headquarters, the irony hit me square in the chest. I'd spent years delivering packages to buildings like this, faceless towers filled with people who never noticed the guy in the brown uniform. And now, those same kinds of people were shaking my hand and calling me Mr. Thompson. "Welcome to the board, sir," one of them said as we walked into the main conference room. Cameras flashed. News outlets had already caught wind of the story. War hero's grandson inherits forgotten fortune. The media loved it. They called it poetic justice, a 70-year promise finally fulfilled. But I wasn't thinking about headlines. I was thinking about what Harold had said before I left his house that day. "We can't choose how our ancestors are remembered, but we can decide what their legacy becomes." Those words became my compass. During my first board meeting, I listened more than I spoke. The executives discussed quarterly profits, logistics routes, automation systems, things I'd seen from the other side of the wheel for years. When they started talking about cost efficiency, I interrupted gently. "Do any of you know how your drivers live?" I asked. The room went quiet. A few exchanged glances. "I was one of them," I continued. "You talk about optimizing delivery schedules, but most of your drivers are skipping meals to meet deadlines. Some sleep in their vans because overtime pay barely covers gas. If you really want to honor this company's name, start by treating the people who move it with dignity." The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, but it didn't scare me. I'd faced silence my whole life, after the divorce, after my failures. This time, it felt different. This silence listened. After the meeting, the CEO, a woman named Amanda Reyes, approached me privately. "That was bold, Mr. Thompson," she said, half smiling. "Most new board members don't speak up their first day." "I'm not most board members," I said. She nodded. "Clearly not. And honestly, good for you. We could use a voice like yours around here." That night, as I drove home in my same old truck, I thought about how surreal it was. Just a few months ago, I'd been delivering packages to strangers. Now, I had a say in how an entire corporation treated its people. My grandfather's selflessness had opened a door, but it was up to me to walk through it the right way. Over the next few months, I used part of my inheritance to create something called the Henry Thompson Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting veterans, especially those struggling with PTSD and reintegration into civilian life. Harold was the honorary co-founder. He attended the opening ceremony in a wheelchair, tears shining in his eyes as he watched me unveil a bronze plaque with my grandfather's name. When the crowd quieted, I spoke into the microphone, my voice trembling but clear. My grandfather never took his reward because he believed saving a life was enough. But his story proves that goodness echoes. It travels through time, through bloodlines, until it finds its way home. This foundation isn't just for him. It's for every soldier who ever thought their sacrifice would be forgotten. The applause that followed felt like more than approval. It felt like peace. Afterward, Harold pulled me aside. "You've done him proud," he said. "You turned fortune into purpose. That's what your grandfather would have wanted." I smiled. "You gave me the chance to." He chuckled softly. "No, William. Fate did." A few days later, Harold's health began to decline rapidly. I visited him often at the hospital, reading aloud from the old letters we'd found in his box, letters written by soldiers, by my grandfather, by a generation that carried courage in silence. Each time I read, Harold would smile faintly, as if he was hearing the voices of old friends again. One evening, he gripped my hand and whispered, "William, promise me something. Anything. When I'm gone, don't let this become about money. Let it stay about people. About honor." I swallowed hard. "I promise." He smiled weakly. "Then I can go knowing Henry's spirit lives on. Through you." A week later, Harold passed away peacefully in his sleep. His lawyer called me soon after to inform me that Harold had left a final letter addressed to me, sealed with the same gold emblem as before. My hands shook as I opened it. "Dear William, if you're reading this, I've joined your grandfather for one last drink somewhere beyond this world. I've left you the mansion, not as wealth, but as a home for your foundation. Fill it with stories, not silence. Let it be a place where people heal. Remember, the truest inheritance isn't gold or stocks. It's the courage to do the right thing when no one's watching. Your old friend, Harold Whitmore." I folded the letter slowly, tears blurring the words. In the months that followed, we turned the mansion into the Thompson Whitmore Center for Veterans. The rooms that once held secrets now echoed with laughter, therapy sessions, shared meals, and music. The same fireplace where Harold had opened that box now warmed the hands of men and women learning to believe in life again. Every time I walked those halls, I felt both of them with me, Harold and my grandfather, two men bound by war, connected by fate, and reunited through love that defied time. Sometimes, when the sun set over the garden, I'd stand there with my hands in my pockets, feeling the cool metal of the dog tag and whisper, "We did it, Grandpa. We finally brought your promise full circle." And for the first time in my life, I wasn't running from the past. I was carrying it forward. I spent the following days helping Mr. Ellington's lawyer handle the paperwork. Every signature I wrote felt unreal, like I was signing for someone else's life. The mansion, the land, the company, everything was now legally mine. But what mattered more than any of it was the story behind how it came to me. A story that had crossed 7 decades, 2 wars, in the hands of 2 men who never met, but shared the same sense of duty. On the final day, the lawyer handed me a small, sealed envelope. "This was addressed to you by name," he said. "Mr. Ellington wrote it the night before he passed." I took it home and sat on the old couch in my apartment, the same one I'd slept on after my divorce. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, his handwriting was shaky but elegant. "William, if you're reading this, I'm finally at peace. Meeting you gave my life its closing chapter. Your grandfather saved me in Korea when we were both boys pretending to be men. I promised myself that if I ever made something of my life, I would find his family and repay that debt. But it was never just about money. It was about honor. He gave me life. You reminded me why it mattered. Use this inheritance to build something that lasts, not just for yourself, but for others. Your grandfather believed in kindness without expectation. Carry that forward. Edward Ellington." I folded the letter, tears streaming down my face. For the first time in years, I didn't feel broken. I didn't feel divorced, poor, or lost. I felt connected to my family's past, to a stranger who became kin, to something larger than myself. The next morning, I drove back to the mansion. The morning sun filtered through the oaks, painting the driveway in gold. I walked to the front steps and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa. And thank you, Mr. Ellington." Weeks later, I reopened the small logistics business I'd once dreamed of. But this time, I named it Thompson and Ellington Deliveries. The logo was simple, a dove carrying an envelope, because one letter had changed everything. Now, every time I deliver a package, I remember that day, the old man at the door, the trembling voice saying, "You're a Thompson, aren't you?" And I realize that sometimes life delivers us to the exact doorstep where we're meant to be found. And to everyone watching this story right now, let me ask you something. Do you believe in fate, or do you think it's all coincidence? Have you ever met someone who seemed placed in your path for a reason? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read them. If this story touched you, please like this video, share it with someone who might need hope today, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional, life-changing stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and wherever you are in the world tonight, may life deliver you something beautiful, too. Sometimes, life writes stories we could never invent. One choice, one meeting, one old letter, can change everything we thought we knew about who we are. If this story moved you, remember, fate often finds us when we least expect it, sometimes disguised as a simple knock on the door. I'm William, and this channel is all about stories that remind us we're never truly alone. Because somewhere, someone's life might be tied to ours in ways we can't yet see. If you haven't already, please like, comment, and subscribe to join our growing family of listeners. Share this story with a friend who believes in destiny, or maybe needs a reason to believe again. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and may life deliver your next miracle when you least expect it.